Welcome to Season 3 of This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley, podcast about the Bay Area, technology, and culture. I'm your host, Sunil Rajaraman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Yasha Kakis-Wolf. Hey, Yasha.
What's happening, man? How's it going?
Yasha, if you had to describe Indian culture in 2 or 3 sentences, what would you come up with?
Oh my gosh. Have we talked about the wedding that I went to in southern India where I spent almost a month there and the wedding was over the course of 2 weeks? Have I talked to you about that?
You haven't talked to me about that, but it's funny that you bring up weddings because the talk of the town right now is Indian Matchmaking, a show on Netflix that I would say would you say controversial is a fair word to describe it?
God, really? I don't think I would call it controversial, but maybe that's because I'm not of South Indian descent.
So, this is a kind of a special episode, and it's one that's near and dear to my heart as an Indian American. I mean, this show has really captured the attention of America, and the premise for those of you listening is, and who haven't watched the show, several couples are trying to find love through the services of a matchmaker. And it calls every stereotype there is about Indians in America into question, and and magnifies it. We had the pleasure of interviewing one of the show's quote unquote contestants, Srinivas Rao.
This is a fun conversation. I enjoyed it being there and also being a bystander to the conversation that the two of you had. You asked me an important question. How would I summarize Indian culture? I don't know that I would be able to summarize it in a couple of sentences, but it is clearly a very tangible discussion that the two of you have that's steeped in all of the ceremonies and expectations and stereotypes that exist in the culture that you grew up in.
Yeah, this discussion went in directions I had not at all expected. So we hope you enjoyed today's special edition of This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley, and hope you enjoy the interview.
Thank you for taking a little bit of time in this afternoon with us. We appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Hey, where are you dialing in from? Are you in the Bay Area right now?
No, I moved to Colorado, I think at the beginning of this year. Like, we came in November to give it a test drive and see if we liked it. A lot of my close friends were here. I didn't have a lot of close friends in San Diego. And so that was just one of those things. Like, I moved out of my parents' house at 38, right? So it's a weird thing to be that old and to try to begin to build a social life from scratch. Mm-hmm. And, because all your friends are married, having kids, and here you are still single. And it's okay, who's there to hang out on a Friday night? And eventually I think it just kind of got to the point where why am I doing this? I'm I'm going to go, I went there to surf and that was great. But I also realized I was giving up the, social connection, which is such an important part of our well-being. And so now I ended up in Boulder, and I'm actually absolutely thrilled to be here. It's nice to not pay a fortune to live like a college student.
We hear lots of nice things about Colorado generally. Were you ever in the Bay Area? Was it ever a stopover point for you at any point in time?
Yeah, of course. I went to Berkeley, and then I spent about 10 years in the Bay Area. Then I went to Pepperdine for graduate school. And when I saw that it was 80 degrees and sunny in January, I realized I was never coming back to the Bay Area.
Well, yeah, I can totally feel that. Hey, so we want to talk about you and some stuff going on in your life right now that I'm sure a lot of people are interested in as well. But this is a podcast about the Bay Area. So I'm kind of curious, before we jump into that, what's your hot take on the Bay Area right now? You're in Colorado, so that says something about your view on California. But what's going on in San Francisco in your mind right now?
Well, I think that the reality of San Francisco is that it's basically it's basically the literal embodiment of the inequality problem we're facing, right? I have friends who make plenty of money, and to them the Bay Area, they feel stretched, that they can't have nice houses or anything, and they're trying to start families, and they all have good jobs. I mean, we're talking people who went to places like Stanford, and they feel stressed. So I think part of it I think what has happened basically is you've had this like amazing hotbed of innovation that has led to this immense amount of wealth creation and a lot of things. And the truth be told, like much of what's happened in the Bay Area made my career that I have possible. Like none of it would be possible because, like I went to college with Sunil's wife, and 20 years ago, to build a website, you needed like hundreds of hours, thousands of dollars, and a lot of technical skills. And if you didn't have the skills to bridge that gap between a creative idea and, something that you wanted to execute, then, that was all for nothing. So I think that's been the upside. The downside, of course, is that, it's basically created this really sort of uneven income distribution. So I went to, I did a study abroad in Brazil when I was my second semester, like my first semester, second year at Pepperdine. And at that time, Brazil had the highest Gini coefficient in the world. I don't know if this is accurate or not, so you'll have to fact check me on this, but I believe today we do. And, that's in the matter of 10 years. So is the Bay Area to blame for that? No. But the thing is that, the Bay Area has created lots of jobs. And at the same time, it's kind of like there's this massive concentration of wealth to the point where I have friends who literally were putting their unborn children on waiting lists for schools, and they got calls 5 years later after they'd moved away to say the person that their child, who is now a kindergartner, is not even accepted to the school but off the waiting list.
That's a real thing. I mean, that's still totally a real thing. I don't want to skip over the fact that you said you went to college with Sunil's wife. So I just want to call that out. And I don't know that I have a question about it. I just want to call it out. I also want to let you know that we have no fact checkers here.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So let's talk about just the connectedness of the Indian community in the Bay Area and elsewhere. And Srini, we're allowed to, of course, for our listeners, you can't physically see me, but as it turns out, I'm Indian, and Srini is Indian as well.
Yeah.
But Indians are pretty interconnected in the Bay Area and elsewhere. I would say that stereotype is generally true. Would you agree?
Yeah. Oh, that's an understatement. It's like how, most people talk about 6 degrees of separation. Indians have 2. Like like my parents, anytime they're like, oh, there's Telugu. I'm like, Mom, every Telugu person you've ever introduced me to is related to me. Unless you want deformed grandchblendren, I don't think that's a good idea. So no, but it's true. Like even Ramit Sethi, like the popular, blogger who runs the site I Will Teach You to Be Rich, and, this like wildly successful business and, New York Times bestselling book. He actually put an Instagram post saying that like he actually talked about these sort of, underground networks or sort of invisible networks that exist within Indian communities where word just spreads. And I think there's something that's the interesting thing is like, we really are all incredibly connected. Like to me, it was insane that my parents went in 2016 to India and they were running into relatives who I had no idea who they were were listening to our podcast. And I was like, that's insane. So yeah, I mean, to say we're connected. As far as your wife goes, Sunil, I have nothing but fond memories of her. She's one of my favorite people because of the fact that she was willing to tolerate my insane amount of bullshit and my unfiltered way of going about life and saying whatever the hell I wanted. And somehow she was able to look past that and see that I was a decent person underneath all that. Whereas I think other people...
We had it in common.
I was going to say, you were like the Sunil before Sunil.
For 12 years. Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, that was one thing I remember about her very distinctly is like, I never felt judged by her, which is why I liked her so much. I was like, wow, and I'm, cause I mean, she did a road trip or two with me and a friend of mine who was a foreign exchange student from Hong Kong. I mean, and some of us, I mean, imagine 2 guys and, and not really acknowledging the fact that there was a girl there and acting as if we would if there was no woman there. And she still was able to like see the humor in it, which is why I think I've always adored her. Like I was like thrilled to hear from you guys. I was like, oh, and yeah, I mean that is, she was one of the few people I did feel that I was like, oh, this is a person who's not judgmental at all.
So, on the podcast stuff, right? And so how it happened was, Chitra and Srini randomly reconnected, of course, and also, Vijay Raghunathan, another good friend of ours, did a socially distant, and Yasha, sorry, you're kind of being excluded from the Indian Insider Baseball here for a couple minutes. Just bear with me.
I'm like excluded from my house also, Sunil, so that's fine.
Vijay, Chitra and I were chatting about Srini, of course, in the show, and Chitra and Srini reconnected. Srini, I mean, look, it's hard to have a conversation with you right now without talking about Indian matchmaking. So let's just get right into it.
Yeah, I will. By the way, I have to comment on the Vijay thing. So that connection runs even more deep than you thought, right? So I don't know if you know who Ishita Gupta is. So Vijay's wife is the twin sister of one of my podcast guests.
Oh my gosh, that's okay. Now we're all. We can do some, some offline connecting the dots here. Listeners, you can, look up all these people if you can spell the last names and see if they're connected on Facebook or Instagram. But, on the show, let's get into that. So it has captured a real moment here in a way, almost like Tiger King did at the start of the pandemic. How did you decide to go on the show, right? Because it feels like that's a high risk, high reward thing. How was it presented to you, and how did you decide to go on?
Well, I mean, I think that it was introduced me to it through, coincidentally speaking of Indians who are networked, through a friend from college who, I still was in touch with, who was another creative person. And, it sounded interesting to me. And I was like, all right, I'm single. I'm, at this point where it's like, okay, this could be interesting. My attitude was, best case scenario, I meet somebody amazing. Worst case scenario, I'm the most eligible Indian bachelor in America, as your wife joked the other day. Which, trust me, that's nowhere as near as cracked up to be as you might think that sounds. This week has been exhausting.
And so was it like an email? Was it a phone call when the producers got in touch?
Yeah.
What did they say to you exactly?
Well, I mean, it was just like, hey, well, when we talk, and we just kind of had a phone call, they gave me the sort of rundown of, okay, we're doing a documentary film. This is what the process is. I mean, my only question for them was, why me? And I was like, that, and it was because I was not a doctor, engineer, lawyer. I think that I was their token weirdo, basically. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you actually came out, looking very incredibly smart, to your credit. Now, I want to turn it over to a non-Indian, Yasha, for a question after I ask this one, just to get the different perspectives. But, one question I just broadly want to ask about the show, and just in your opinion, one piece of pushback I get from our community as well, it feeds some stereotypes about, fair, tall, et cetera, especially for women, and traditional roles for men. What's your just general thought and reflection on that? If you had to,
so you read the article that I wrote, the one on Medium about what I call the South Asian cultural arms race for impressive bio data. I don't even know how the hell I came up with that title, but I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to put it. It to me, it revealed a lot of what I think were already problems in this entire system. And I think it's only our generation that has been I think we're vocalizing something our generation has been feeling for the last 15 years. It's just that they've never been given a platform to really talk about it. And I think that that's one of the big things to me. You asked, what's the risk? What's the upside? I also, you got to remember, I had a very clear edge going into this over, most people who do media, because I've done media for 10 years. I produced a podcast. You've sold companies, so you know damn well that everything that you do in a public presence is a reflection on the people who invest in you. And, so I was very mindful of that. And so that's that was the thing. I knew that my skills as an interviewer would come in handy, because I can control the direction of a conversation pretty well at this point if I want to. You get me off of an interview, I'm really chatty, as you learned the other day, so from talking with your wife, I talk too much, but I was mindful of that as well. And But I understood. I was like, media is an incredibly powerful tool to shape perception. And that's the thing I think that is very easy to understand and misunderstand, right? You see 5 minutes of somebody's life and you make all these conclusions. Think about what you do, just looking at a person's Instagram feed, you never see what happens between the uploads, right? It's, there's a guy, Seth Godin always makes reference to this book by Scott McCloud called Understanding Comics. And he always talks about what happens in between the panels. That's where the real story is. And of course, that's the same thing with Instagram, or any social platform. It's what is happening between the status updates, between the Instagram uploads.
As my favorite writer, David Foster Wallace, puts it, it's not about the images, it's about crafting an image. I think that's what social media has become. If you were alive to see Instagram, you would have,
let's get into that. Yeah, let's get into that a little bit. So if you think about in between the panels, I've often wondered on dating shows generally, like independent of whatever's shown, is there really any possibility that a connection can happen, or is it all just total manipulated panels on Instagram bullshit at the end of it to sell the show? Like, can you really find a connection?
I would say yes. I mean, I may not have, but I don't think that it was entirely, out of possibility. Look, inevitably, like, you got cameras rolling, you're gonna, if you're self-aware, you will kind of think about, like, it's hard not to be mindful of the fact that those are there, especially if you're like me and you had a public presence for 10 years that basically, involves book deals with publishers, like I said, investor money from, investors, and an existing audience that you pretty much knew would see it. And that audience already has an image in their head of who you are and what you're like, right? Like they've been, and fortunately theirs is much deeper from 1,000 interviews, but even theirs is not entirely accurate because when I'm not behind the microphone, what am I doing? I'm sitting here with my roommate playing video games and drinking vodka at 4:00 in the afternoon. Like it's not exactly the picture of an ideal future son-in-law for an Indian mom, But the thing is that's precisely, what it is that media, is really powerful in creating images. So, yeah, I think so. I think it's entirely possible because what are you doing? You're meeting a person. So anytime you meet somebody, regardless of the context, of course it's possible. I don't think that I would have wanted to do it. Like some people are like, oh, was this just a, publicity stunt? I was like, no, I mean, I'm 40 years old. I want to meet somebody. And the funny thing is I remember my big question was like, well, what happens if I'm dating somebody like by the time we start filming? And we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And that never happened. So,
that's fascinating. You sound like a pretty optimistic person, though. I mean, you could be totally cynical, kind of digging in that conversation as well, right?
Yeah. So again, like, what's the point, though, right? Like, even if you see, like, look, a lot of the criticism is warranted about, like, the colorism. I mean, I called all that on my own article on Medium. And so that stuff is, because the thing is, I think the most impressive thing about this is that it actually exposed a lot of things that we all know and exist, but nobody has ever talked about. It's like, and now they're out, and they're out in the zeitgeist and they're out in the mainstream public and they're starting conversations that we should have been having 20 years ago. Yeah. As kids who grew up in this country, like it shouldn't have taken us this long to get to the point where we're having this conversation. I don't know. Like it's the cynical part of me. And that's why even when I wrote the article on Medium, I was very careful not to just present the downsides of all this. I wanted to also paint a balanced picture to say, look, there are very good things about the ways that Indian parents teach their kids to, like, not, sometimes, like, people get money for A's. Our parents are like, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. And that right there is a perfect example of intrinsic motivation. The problem is it goes off the rails to the point where it shifts from being intrinsic to extrinsic because it becomes all about parental validation.
Speaking of validation, what happens to you as a human who goes on a show that's on Netflix in, let's say, the social media world? Like, what happens to you? Does it blow up? Or are things the same as they ever were?
Well, it just really depends. One, on the scale of it. Obviously, the success of the show. I mean, I had no idea this was going to end up being on a top 10 show on Netflix. And the thing is, like, I'm literally hearing from, like, Indian friends. I thought, they might be interested in it, right? Nobody else, I'm hearing from friends from every walk of life who are watching this thing, and I'm just like, this is kind of insane. And I'm actually very relieved that it's not happening, on too big a scale for me. Like, I think other people are probably experiencing it on much, because I was only in one episode. To be honest, to me, it's been really pleasant. Like, I've gotten very nice messages from people who've all dug into the podcast. Like, a lot of old friends, like your wife, have contacted me. That's been amazing. So in all honesty, like, I think, like, I can honestly say, to me, it's been nothing but upside, minus the sort of, people starting to call my parents, like that part has been a bit annoying and invasive. And I, to the point where I had one call with one of my parents' friends, and I called my cousin and I was like, you're officially the gatekeeper. And when my dad texted, he's like, hey, did you talk to this auntie? I was like, yeah. I'm like, from this point forward, I'm not going to deal with anybody other than Rama. I'm like, anybody can talk to her. And so it's great because now I'm protected, because she's awesome and she knows me well. And, like I trust her judgment and, but 90% of it has been people checking out the podcast. Like I said, I mean, when people are like, I'm not going to engage in bashing anybody. Like when people are like, oh, I just discovered your podcast. Those are people that I'm really engaging with, more than anything else. Of course, as you might imagine, like there like a lot of random, women come out of the woodworks. But again, it's exactly what I said. Like it's that whole what's happening between the panels and their interpretation, of who I am is not entirely accurate.
Do you talk to people that were on the show after the show? Do you talk to Netflix at all? Like, is the same experience? Is that a consistent experience across other participants on the show? Like, is it all kind of just okay?
I couldn't tell you. Yeah. That I couldn't tell you. Like, I don't know the details. I mean, I've been in touch with the people who produced it and all that, and just but beyond that, not really. I mean, it's like I've never most of like I saw what you guys did. That's all I know. Like it was, I didn't see anything until last Thursday or Wednesday. Yeah, it was last Thursday. God. What a long, holy shit. I can't believe it's only been that long.
Seems like it's been longer.
It feels like it's been part of the culture. I mean, I think it's pandemic time. Like what it's done is it's everything that's being released now, and Netflix has done such a good job with the docuseries stuff. I mean, and Last Dance is the other one, right? Like, so I feel like Tiger King, Last Dance, and this show have really...
Last Dance was incredible. I love that.
Really, really good show. But look, I mean, I have a number of other questions. I know, like, so for our listeners, and I think if you have questions about specific characters, we're not going to get into this episode. So because we're much more interested in sort of higher level questions, and so I just want to to listeners who are like, oh, I want to talk about this character, we're not going to do that right now because there's plenty of social media stuff about that.
Yeah, and like what can I comment on that really quick? Whether you like a person or not, whoever is listening out there, no matter what it is, like at the end of the day, like behind all those avatars, behind the profile pictures, they're still real people, every one of us, right? And no matter how thick-skinned anybody is, like it doesn't, like, I can tell you as an author, right? Like I can tell you, like I navigating criticism is something I have to teach a lot of people who want to write books to do. And I can tell you, like, to this day, man, I have a Wall Street Journal best-selling book with like 300 5-star reviews, and the only review I can quote to you by memory is the woman who wrote me a 2-star review and said, I hope this guy's a better surfer than he is a writer. And so I just want people to think about the fact that, like, behind every one of those like really mean tweets that you send or things that you say, there are people, like, yeah, they may not see it, but like, especially if there are women listening to this, like, think about the fact that, many of you are mothers with daughters, and like, put yourself in their shoes, like, because, like, to me, I'm like, okay, we have an opportunity to set a different example here. Whether like, and I'm not defending anybody or anything, but like, at the same time, like, I don't want to be, particularly because I built an entire brand around telling stories that make the world a better place. And I never want that to be at somebody's expense.
So, Srini, I am curious. A lot of the way that the show is framed is what your perspective match wanted. I am curious if we had to reframe it to what you want and what you're looking for. And I'm particularly curious to know, and we're not trying to match you from this podcast and get you more done. It sounds like you have plenty of that, but it's more just kind of more cultural question, which is, in the Medium post, really good. But just the thought on what a South Indian, American-born person is looking for in this day and age. Like, how would you characterize that to the outside world?
Yeah, well, okay, so I think that I'm sort of the anomaly, right? Like, I think that what most people would want probably is what I wouldn't. Like, I was saying this the other day. I just couldn't help but observe, like, every time, particularly older people who'd be like, they would try to tell me about somebody. And all they would tell me was that the person, like, this is this person's occupation and, you know, they're Telugu or this or that. And I'm like, well, yeah, what the hell does that tell me? Like, how is that a criteria? Like, that's it? Those are your standards? Like, come on, you know? It's like, why don't we set a higher bar here? But I mean, that also speaks volumes to like what the problem is here. You know, like there's no question of, you know, character, like, or, you know, look, I mean, I think that pretty clearly, if you look at my life, I don't necessarily want the sort of stable white picket fence, life that I think many Indian people do. And, you know, maybe it's changing with other generations. And, you know, like, you know, some Indian girl may be like, oh yeah, I would love that. But her parents would hate it. You know, I know this from, you know, weird dinner that I had once with my own parents where, you know, we were sitting down and like, oh, you know, would you like us to introduce you to anybody? Would you be open to it? I was like, yeah, fine. And, you know, I posed the question, what are you going to tell them about what I do for work? And, you know, that kind of killed it because my parents were very clear about the fact that like, look, we don't care, but we know that this will be an issue for any of our friends. And I was like, well, I don't want any part of that. These people have been your friends for a long time. The last thing we need to do is damage, you know, 20-year friendships over the fact that you're trying to set me up with a girl. And that was it. It was left at that. So I think it's hard.
How
you know,
do you
like
feel about, you know, like, so, you know, and you have taken it kind of goes without saying. I mean, we know this, Indian community listening to this, it's like, you know, there's a lot of pressure to be a doctor or an engineer in particular. And you've taken a non-traditional path, you know, yourself. How do you feel about how you were framed in the show? Like just the framing of, hey, this is who Srini is. Do you feel like that was fair, or, you know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I feel it was totally fair. Like there was nothing in there that wasn't inaccurate. I mean, my brother-in-law got on my case because he said I completely downplayed, you know, what I did, which to some degree that's true. But I also think it was a really good litmus test to see how not just any one person would react, but the culture as a whole would interpret that. You know, without me giving too much detail, because look, I could have been like, okay, yeah, I write books. One of them is a Wall Street Journal bestseller. The other two led to a pretty substantial book contract. Yeah, I run a podcast, but it has thousands of people around the world who listen. And, you know, like I didn't mention any of that on purpose. And yeah, I get paid, you know, 5-figure amounts to do keynote speeches. And yeah. The problem with all of those things is it goes back to that David Brooks thing that I wrote about in the Medium article, which is those are resume values. And I think that to me, I was very clear about the fact that I wanted to be viewed through the lens of what, you know, character would be, eulogy values. And I think that they did a great job portraying that. Like, I think that to me was one of the best things to come out of it because, yeah, I mean, some of the tweets are funny. Somebody's like, how did nobody Google the fact to go see like that you've built this massive body of work? And even your wife said, you know, she's like the one person who seems to have revealed almost nothing in this entire experience as a byproduct to be on the show is you. Like, it's like nobody knows anything about you. They have to go look.
Yeah, no, it's true. So Yasha, I'm actually curious to ask Yasha a question. I rarely do this. We can't do it really very easily during the pandemic because we, you know, as a non-Indian person, just as like a white guy who lives in Marin County. Sorry, that's a very.
Thanks, Sunil. Technically, I live in Sonoma County, Sunil. That changes that whole equation.
Oh yeah, that's what I meant. Yasha and I have like a very deep 8-year-long friendship, so I'm allowed to make jokes at his expense like this for our listeners who've been listening for a long time. You know that. But what was your takeaway from the show, Yasha, as somebody who's not, you know, a cultural native? Like, what was your takeaway? Well,
so two things. One, like, I'm not finished. So I'm just going to talk about the first few episodes that I've watched, but I'm kind of reflecting on the conversation that we're having here. Like, Srini, I really struggle with kind of resume attributes as a way to introduce yourself or a way to think about the value of somebody else. And I think that showed up for me in a way that was maybe not super surprising, but it felt really tough for me as a dad. I have 2 daughters, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, Am I going to find myself in a situation where my point of view on somebody that my daughter is thinking about is going to be about the attributes of the resume? So I think my reflection on the show ended up being more like self-loathing of like, crap, like, am I doing this? Is this what my kids are going to think about? Is this how I'm going to interact? Then maybe reflecting on it culturally, but I do appreciate the questions, Sunil, because I think that there's there's some challenges that we have culturally that the show, at least for me, like independent of my race and my origin, highlighted that I think are pretty dynamic cultural issues that we're all kind of dealing with.
But did you walk away with a positive or negative view of South Asian culture?
I wouldn't say either. I'm going to do like the non-answer. I think no. Like I took it's the panels of the show. So something that Sunil and I don't talk a ton about, and Trini, interesting or not for you. I was actually on MTV's Singled Out way back in the day. In fact, I worked on Singled Out for a few years as well, and so I kind of developed this very perverse view of like everything that's reality TV is totally BS. It's scripted. There are writers that are sitting in the background. They're training people on what to say so that it feels like it's authentic. And so I have a very kind of caustic view in anything that I watch that is reality. So I don't necessarily see it and I'm like, culturally, this show's bad. I'm like, culturally, this is a reality TV show. So that's that's kind of more direct the way that I think about it, Sunil. It's not about South Asian culture.
And then positioning it back to Srini, like what would you say to people who said, kind of reflecting on Yasha's takeaway, oh my gosh, the show seems super scripted, et cetera. In your view, was it? Go ahead on that.
No, I mean, look, I can't speak to what happens after, I filmed it because like all I did was show up and, had them film and went home. So, like, I mean, you guys run a podcast, Sunil, you ran a media publication. At the end of the day, like media is about narratives. Like, so I'll give you an example. Right now, there's an article in New York Times about the 36 questions to make anybody fall in love. And, like I was like, okay, I want to try to do this, like an episode of this as a podcast. And, it was based on the fact that I'd actually used those 36 questions on a first date and ended up being this really amazing first date. But obviously that would be weird as shit to record a first date and tell somebody I'm using this for a podcast. So I had my roommate and his girlfriend do it. And, like when you hear it, it'll sound like this incredibly sort of, story. It's like, that's actually how that all played out. And it was like, well, some of it, yes, but like where the story gets made is in editing. Editing is about telling a story. I mean, as you said, like, so, and again, that's true. That doesn't matter whether it's reality TV or not. That's true for any form of entertainment that you create. I mean, hell, it's true for the news. Like, I'm sure, you probably see edited versions of a lot of things. And of course, because the truth is like, it's just designed around like the way humans consume information, like the way our attention works, which mine is virtually non-existent for school at Berkeley. But that's a story for another day.
Well, look, that sounds like a separate podcast that maybe you should do. But the, if you had to just, I know you talked about this at the start, and I just wanted to crystallize the answer a little bit more. But, what ultimately was I mean, you're a media guy and you have a really deep understanding of how it works. But what was your ultimate motivation for going on? Like, was it, if you had to answer just deep inside of yourself right now, was it to find love or was it? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, the challenge was saying you're going there to like just find love, in my mind, was going in with too many expectations, which is a recipe for disappointment, which was my dating life, up until that point. Like I learned sort of, in the last year, it was kind of like, I'm realizing there's one commonality to every dating situation that ends up being this huge disappointment. And it's that I have so many expectations from that situation. Like, obviously that's very much a cultural thing because you feel like every girl you meet might have to be the one that you're going to marry. And of course you scare them away when that's how you're coming across. So like I, did I go there thinking, oh, this is going to be like, I if I don't find love, I'm going to be so disappointed. No. Was I open to it? Yes. But I also went in very clear that like, you can't, having it was A.R. Rahman who said, when you expect nothing, everything comes to you. And so to me, that was just kind of a good way after a year, like, long just fight with like, struggling with my dating life. I was like, okay, that's it. I'm just going to go into every date expecting nothing. Let's just say that those dates went really well when I did that. So, and that was that was a profound lesson for me in detachment and, how much more attractive everybody is when they have no sort of expectation of the situation. Cause then you have like this freedom to like express yourself that you don't otherwise. And and the thing is, there's like a, lightness to the whole situation. There's not this heavy layer of, oh, it has to turn into something. It has to be something. It's like, I just met you. Like, I have no expectation of this situation.
That's curious on that. So this is my last question, and then I know Yasha has the our wrap up question, which we talked about, but this is more of just a guilty pleasure research question. Shout out to Amrita from Twitter who helped craft this question. But just basically, I am curious about this. Did you for those who haven't watched the show, Srini's obviously matched with an individual, but did you research or Google this individual before meeting them? And, to what extent did you research them before that first meeting?
No, not at all. That's always an interesting thing. Like, it's funny because when you're me, like the ability, this actually causes actually a lot of challenges for me with, dating apps. Because I'm not the average person you're going to find on a dating app. Like if you Google me, there's no shortage of stuff you're going to find. So you go in with this sort of, oh, great, this person knows all this stuff about me and I know nothing about them. That's not really, ideal. So no, I mean, not at all.
All right, but the way you answer that made me think you're the kind of person who like opens up Bumble and doesn't look past the first picture because you just want to be excited and interested when you meet somebody and see all the rest of the things.
Yeah, that's probably true. That's fair. Although that's a whole other conversation about, guys and their biological reaction to Bumble. That's another, rabbit hole. Yeah, I mean, look, do I want to know something? But yeah, I mean, to me, it's like, what's the point? It's even by design, I interview all sorts of people, right? Ranging from, porn stars to presidential candidates. And the funny thing is people always say they're almost, they're always said, well, the depth of the questions you ask, you must do so much research. And I think it's deceiving because I do almost no research. I'll read their about page just so I have a sense of an arc, because to me, the whole interview is a process of discovery. And I think that that's just a more exciting way to go about it. And I think that's kind of a way I would, approach this too. It's why would you do all that? There'd be nothing left to discover at that point.
Well, we have that in common because neither Yasha or I did any research about you before this interview. So
no. Cool.
It makes it more fun.
Yeah, Yasha, you're supposed to laugh. What the hell?
No, I was laughing on the inside, Neil.
It doesn't work as well.
It was really good laughing on the inside.
Well, I want the pandemic to be over so we can just do this shit in real life again. Sorry,
I know.
I was smiling with my eyes.
I feel you. I want the pandemic to come, be over so I can actually see you guys in real life for one, and we could actually do this with booze.
This is not a Joe Rogan operation,
Absolutely,
just to be clear.
Or it sounds like ecstasy is your thing. Maybe you can do ecstasy and we can just
not anymore. I mean, I was debating whether I smoke a joint before I come and do this with you guys. And I was like, I'll do that afterwards.
Hey, so with that note,
Sasha,
this has been a blast. This has been an absolute blast. We have one question that we asked every guest on the podcast. But first, I want to figure out where you spend your time on social networks. Which of the networks do you spend your time on? You're 90% Facebook and 10% Twitter?
Okay, so up until this week, I had more or less quit all three of them. For literally the last 90 days. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Cal Newport fan. The guy wrote a book called Deep Work. He's a professor at Georgetown. And so I quit. I literally stopped, I think sometime in late January the beginning of January. And if you actually go look at my Instagram feed and even my Facebook feed prior to this last week, I think the last update was sometime in December. I think I made a documentary film about the women in my family, and that was the last time that I shared anything on social media, just because I wanted to share it and I wanted to have my family members see it. But so that was, so it's hard for me to say. I've always liked Twitter more than I like Facebook because I don't find it nearly as distracting. Although this week it's been incredibly distracting. Mm-hmm. But I think I like Twitter because I've found a lot of really interesting people who ended up being guests on my podcast via Twitter. Whereas Facebook just seems like a giant mess. It's overwhelming. I mean, this whole week has been overwhelming. My roommate's no wonder you're so tired. He's you're probably experiencing media burnout. And so I tend to like, in that sense, like Twitter, but we actually, for Unmistakable, we use a private social, like we built our platform for our community on Mighty Networks because, like I like owning my content. Like I like owning my data, and I, don't like the fact that an algorithm will determine whether the audience that I spent years building will see it or not. And the fact that I have to pay to access the audience that I built.
Here.
So I think,
well, I'm totally with you. I appreciate that. So now that we have a little bit of a sense of where you're spending some energy, and maybe we'll consider moving forward in those places for our listeners, is there a recommended follow or two that you wanted to throw out?
Yeah, I mean, if you follow the Unmistakable Creative Instagram feed, like I'm fingers crossed, my personal Instagram will pretty much be more or less not very active after this week. I'm like, already kind of like, wow, this is draining. Like I forgot how draining this is. And the thing is, that was before any of this happened. And now I'm just like, holy shit, this is like just, a total drain, like on my like mental energy. Granted, I didn't sleep very well last night, so maybe that's why I feel this way right now. But I think that this contributed to that as well.
Yeah.
So it's, Unmistakable CEO on Instagram. I'm at the point where it's like, I'll check it once a week. Like I don't even have this stuff installed on my phone. Like I delete it for weeks at a time. Just because I know, I mean, you guys have interviewed the CEO of Instagram. You guys know better than anybody, given what you do. Like this stuff is designed to be addictive.
So Srini, I think Yasha, in addition to, by the way, follow Srini on social. We want one outside of you.
Yeah.
Oh, outside of me, do you like a social following? Somebody you should follow on social, or
that's right.
Who do you follow? Who do you follow on social? Any platform. Who do you?
Who I think is who I've always said has had a really big impact on my thinking is Julian Smith. Julian is like, I think he was an investor in whatever that company was that you saw me on that chat platform. Julian has just had a way of thinking about the world that he's usually so far ahead of most people, like in the way he thinks. Like he can, and he's incredibly articulate. Like Julian was the one who's turned me on to writing 1,000 words a day. So I'm forever grateful for him to teach me to do that. And it wasn't like he forced me to do it, but I was like, this guy's one of the most popular blogs on the internet. And keep in mind, and the other thing I've always appreciated about him is that he's never let himself be defined by one project. Like when he's ready to move on, he does. So like he's the CEO of a company called Breather, which is like Airbnb for office space. So I would say Julian. All right. That was the first person that came to mind.
We'll take it.
He's great.
Hey, this has been a really fun conversation. We appreciate you taking time with us today.
Yeah, for sure. Of course.
So Neil, what kind of drugs did you take in college?
I was high on life.
Yeah, I think you still are today. I'm kidding. That was actually a crappy setup. That was a really fascinating conversation, super wide ranging. And I thought you guys were both pretty vulnerable talking about some of the insecurities or the challenges that you deal with the stereotypes that you live in.
We've done editions of the podcast where I feel like it's hit us in various different ways. This one really hit close to home for me, of course, because Srinivas knows Chitra, my wife, and several of her college friends and my close friends. So this was an absolute pleasure and was kind of an exploration of my own past in a way.
It was an absolute blast for me to be a part of as well. So thank you guys, both of you, for letting me be a part of the conversation today.
Yasha, you never have to thank us for being part of a podcast that we've co-hosted for now.
Hey, I was thinking today that we might have to actually change into season 4 one of these days. So maybe after the special episode that everybody just listened to, we might move into season 4 pretty soon. But nonetheless, today was an awesome episode. A lot of fun discussion, a lot of important discussion. And if you enjoyed this podcast, wherever you found this podcast, please go back, rate us 5 stars, leave us a comment. We read every single one, and it helps more people find the show. Thanks for listening to This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast as much as Sunil and I enjoyed recording it, please go back to the application you found this podcast on, rank us 5 stars, leave us a comment. We read every single one. Thanks for listening to This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley.